What if I told you you might be capable of killing someone if the right person asked you to? Not you in a moment of rage, not you in a war zone, you, sitting calmly in a quiet room, following instructions, believing you were doing the right thing. In 1961, a psychologist at Yale University ran an experiment that didn't just challenge that idea. It destroyed it. What he found would haunt the scientific community for decades. And what it reveals about you, me, and every human being alive is something most people are never brave enough to confront. This is the Milgram Experiment, and this video may change how you see yourself forever. It's 1961. The Cold War is at its peak. The Nuremberg trials are barely a decade old. The world is still asking a single terrifying question. How did ordinary people do that? Stanley Milgram, a young social psychologist, decides to find out. He places an ad in a New Haven newspaper. Teachers, accountants, postal workers, engineers, ordinary people answer the call. They're told they're participating in a study on memory and learning. Each participant is brought into a lab. They meet a friendly, middle-aged man, the so-called learner. The participant draws a piece of paper. It says, "Teacher." The draw is rigged. It always says teacher. The learner is taken to an adjacent room, strapped to a chair, electrodes attached to his wrist. The teacher sits before a large control panel. A row of switches labeled from 15 volts to 450 volts. The final switch is marked with just two letters, X, X, X. The rules are simple. Every time the learner gives a wrong answer, the teacher administers a shock. And with every mistake, the voltage increases. What the participant doesn't know, the learner is an actor. The shocks are not real, but their responses entirely scripted and terrifyingly convincing. At 75 volts, the learner grunts. At 120 volts, he shouts that the shocks are painful. At 150 volts, he demands to be released. At 285 volts, he screams in what sounds like agony. At 330 volts, silence. Every time a participant hesitated, every time they turned to the experimenter and said, "I don't think I should continue," they were met with one of four responses. "Please continue." The experiment requires that you continue. It is absolutely essential that you continue. You have no other choice. You must go on. No threats, no weapons, no coercion, just a man in a white coat and four sentences. 65% of participants across every background, every education level, every profession, administered the full 450 volts all the way to my ex-friend text. Milgram submitted his findings. Several journals refused to publish them. The American Psychological Association opened an investigation into him for ethical violations. Because the truth was not just uncomfortable, the truth was catastrophic. Before we go further, I need you to sit with something for a second. You just heard that 65% of ordinary people shocked a stranger to what they believed was death. Not soldiers, not criminals, teachers, accountants, people like the ones in your office, like the people in your family, like you. If this is making you uncomfortable, good. That discomfort is important. Hold on to it. If you want to understand why your brain is wired this way, and more importantly, how to protect yourself from it, stay until the end. Because what I'm about to tell you could be the most practically useful thing you hear this year. And if this is already hitting different, drop a comment below. Tell me, do you think you would have stopped? So what actually happened inside those participants' minds? Milgram called it the agentic state. A psychological shift so subtle, most people never notice it happening to them. In normal life, you operate as an autonomous agent. You make decisions, you bear responsibility. But the moment you enter a hierarchical structure, a classroom, a hospital, a corporation, an army, something shifts. You begin to see yourself not as the decision maker, but as an instrument in someone else's plan. And here's the terrifying part. You don't stop feeling discomfort. The participants in Milgram's study were visibly distressed, sweating, trembling. begging to stop, but they continued anyway. Because in the agentic state, the moral weight doesn't disappear. It gets transferred up the chain to whoever gave the order. This is the same psychological mechanism behind every genocide in human history, behind every corporate fraud, behind every "I was just following orders." It is not a flaw in broken people. It is a feature of the human operating system. And without conscious intervention, none of us are immune. Milgram's experiment was replicated across 8 countries: Germany, Italy, Australia, South Africa, Jordan. The results were nearly identical everywhere. But here's what Milgram also found, and almost no one talks about this part. In a variation of the experiment, participants were placed alongside 2 other teachers, also actors, who refused to continue. One refused at 150 volts, another at 210. The result? Compliance dropped from 65% to 10%. One person saying no out loud changed everything. Because in a morally compromised environment, most people aren't waiting to be the hero. They're waiting for permission to be human. They're looking around the room for someone, anyone, to confirm that their discomfort is valid. That resistance is an option. When someone gives them that permission, they take it, almost every time. This means that the most powerful moral act you can perform in a boardroom, in a classroom, at a family dinner, is not necessarily to win the argument. It's simply to be the first voice that says no. Because somewhere in that room, someone is waiting to follow you. Stanley Milgram didn't set out to prove that humans are evil. He set out to prove the opposite, that only a small number of people could ever harm an innocent stranger under authority. He was wrong. And that wrongness became one of the most important lessons in the history of human psychology. The Milgram experiment doesn't tell us we are broken. It tells us we are wired for compliance in ways that evolution built in long before ethics developed. But here's what makes us different from every other species on this planet. We can know this about ourselves. We can study it. We can name it. We can walk into any room and choose differently. So I'll leave you with this. The next time someone in authority tells you to do something that makes your stomach drop, remember that 65%. Remember the silence after 330 volts. And remember that somewhere in the room, someone is waiting for you to speak first. If this hit you, share it with one person who you think needs to hear it. Not to scare them, because knowing this is a form of protection. Like if you want more experiments like this explored on this channel, subscribe if you want to keep asking the uncomfortable questions. And comment below, do you think you would have stopped? Be honest. I'll see you in the next one.